Hello, this is HT Wingnet, and today we're going to take a look at the Odroid HC4 toaster NAS. Yeah, it looks a little ridiculous, right? But basically, that's what they call it. And get this bread out of here. Everybody likes a good piece of toast. But as typical with a toaster, you got to clear out the crumbs. In any case, it's a 2-bay ARM-based NAS. And it uses the Amlogic S905X3 CPU, which is based on the ARM Cortex A55 architecture. And this is made by a company called HardKernel. So this was originally priced to be about 65 bucks, just a bare bones model. And yes, it comes with this plastic shell and the main board here, which you can see here real quick. And that's basically what you have in this device here. And this particular one comes with this OLED module, which bumps the price up an additional 10 bucks. But we'll take a look at that in a minute. In any case, you can go down here to the specs, and you can see here it's got the Amlogic S905X3. It's got 4 gigs of DDR4 RAM, and 2 SATA ports, and a gigabit Ethernet port, an HDMI 2.0 port, and a single USB 2.0 port. And then it's got other things like an SD slot. A cooling fan actually comes with it, and then it's got headers for other items as well. The one thing is that this does not come with a power supply. You have to purchase a separate power supply, but if you buy it from HardKernel directly, they do offer you an option for like 10 bucks. It does use a 15 watt 4 amp power supply, or 15 volt, sorry, 4 amp power supply, and it comes with a barrel type connector, right? So 15 volt, little odd voltage there, not 12 volt like you might typically see, but either way, that's what it requires. And taking a look at the device itself, you can see here there's that LED module. We'll take a look at that when we power this thing up. But it's got a ventilation, and here it's got a gigabit Ethernet port, an HDMI port, a USB 2.0 port, a single one, and a micro SD card slot. That's where you're going to have to install your OS on, and then the power jack there. And over here they've got this little, I think it's a 40 millimeter fan. And basically, right, you've got these SATA connectors here, which are attached to the main board. That main board, again, has 4 gigs of RAM and the ARM CPU, the Cortex A55. And then you can just take a hard drive or an SSD and just pop it in like this. Poof. Okay, so you might be wondering, okay, what can I actually do with this guy? Well, if you want a basic 2-bay NAS, this is affordable, and it's pretty flexible with the ability to add and remove drives as you see fit. And it is a little limited, though. It does not come with any kind of Wi-Fi, and again, it has a single USB 2.0 port, so that may limit its usability a little bit, but it actually is able to power a external hard drive or USB, the 2.5-inch USB hard drive, no problem. Except your transfer rates are going to be limited to about 40 to 50 megabytes per second. You can see here it's got the nice Odroid logo there, and the rest of it's just this plastic casing around it. And I'm going to go ahead and install OpenMediaVault on here, and I'll kind of go through that process real quick. They do have some good guides on HardKernel's website on how to do that, and but I'll still go through the process real quick just so you can see what it takes. And essentially it involves, you can boot off of this. It comes with a what is it? I can't remember the name of it. It's got a boot module on it, so that way you can boot without any card installed, and then you can actually install from there, install a version of Linux, and then from there install a version of OpenMediaVault. And so we'll go ahead and take a look. Alright, so to get started here, basically you're going to need your power supply, right? And then you're going to need a Ethernet port, because this does not support Wi-Fi. And you're going to have to connect it to your network. And then you're also going to need a keyboard and a monitor hooked up to the HDMI port, so that way you can do some initial configuration. After that point, you're not going to need to hook up anything else. And then you're also going to need a micro SD card. A 4 gig, 8 gig, or 16 gig is adequate. I'd say 8 or 16 gig is more reasonable. You don't need anything the fastest, just something reliable. And for OpenMediaVault, it really doesn't require a lot of storage. It doesn't do a whole lot of I/O during its normal operation as well. So just take it and pop it in the back here. actually you don't want to install this yet. We'll go ahead and take a look at the how-to over on their wiki. And if you go here, they actually have installed OMV NAS over on their wiki here. And the first thing you're going to want to do though is boot up the machine just by plugging it in. There is no power switch on here, so you just want to plug it in and go from there. And we're going to go ahead and boot up just by plugging it in. Okay, now that we booted into the device here, let's go ahead and follow the procedure. And it's pretty straightforward. They say exit the shell, oops, and then go ahead and do a type net boot default, and this is going to bring up an option in the menu. Okay, hit exit, and now you can see here we can install, oops, exit. See here now we can install an option of Linux here. So this is where we're going to want to pop in your SD card, right? And it goes face up, poof, just like that. And then I would choose Debian 11, bullseye. Now it rebooted, and we are in this area where we can go ahead and set up the Debian. And by most default should just work for you. Go ahead and do English, United States, American English. Now this whole process will probably take about an hour. So a lot of it's just going to be waiting. So once you get it going, then you kind of just let it go. Please enter the host name for the system. I'm going to call it Debian Odroid. Call it whatever you want. No domain name. United States, Debian.org, and then a proxy, no proxy. Now root password, put whatever you want to. And then a name for the user. You're going to want to create a new user here for sure. I'm going to call mine Odroid. And then your password. And right, now here's where you're going to want to say guided, use entire drive. And you're going to want to choose your SD card and all files in one partition. So all the defaults along here. And then finish partitioning and write changes to disk. And make sure you choose yes. There we go. Now this part's going to take quite a while, so I'll come back when it's been processed. Alright, so this process so far has taken about 8 minutes since the last time I started setting this up. And you can see here it got to a point where it's asking if it wants to share information. I don't like that obviously, but you might want to go over there and choose participate in the usage survey, and I'm just going to select no, and I'll let it continue. Now at this point, with this menu here that you can see, it's giving you an option to install the Debian desktop environment. Since we're going to install OpenMediaVault, we just want to install the command line interface because we don't need the extra GUI resources to clutter up and take away from our installation here. I'm just going to select the default options here and continue. So you want to go down, tab down to continue, and hit enter. Now it says the installation is complete, so now you just want to go ahead and hit continue, and it'll take you back to the desktop, or I guess the command line. Okay, so it did a reboot, and then it's going to automatically boot into the Debian Linux bullseye that's selected there. You can see the countdown at the bottom. And from here we're going to have to issue a couple commands and then get going with the OMV installation. Alright, now at this point we're at the login for Debian Linux, and this is where we have to follow the process here of setting up your user that you created during that setup process. In this case we used Odroid as our username. Whatever you used, use that here. Okay, at this point I kind of made an error here, you can see on the screen, but you're going to want to log in with that user that you created during setup. In this case I used Odroid, and then whatever password you associated with that. Alright, And now you're going to want to give super user capability to that user. So you're going to want to do a su space dash enter and type the password for that user for Odroid. All right, now we are at root. Now we're going to want to go ahead and type usermod space dash a capital G sudo space Odroid, your username. And you now have sudo access through that user. Now the next part is finding out the IP address of your system, because once you get OpenMediaVault installed, you're going to want to access it through the console in a web browser from a desktop, laptop, whatever. Now if you happen to have the LED, see if I can get some light in here, that LED option on this Odroid HC4, it tells you an IP address on here. However, I found that is not accurate. I don't know why it displays that, because if I actually go in to determine the IP address, it's different than what it shows there. So not sure what it's getting at there. In any case, going back to the screen, one way to do this is you can either go into your router and you can, assuming that you've assigned DHCP, it's going to obviously pick a random IP address for that device. And obviously if you selected a static route, then you know what it is. But you can either go into your router and find out what it is, or you can just do an ifconfig. Now ifconfig is not installed by default, so you're going to have to go and install that. So in order to install that, well, that's pretty embarrassing.
How embarrassing.
I didn't realize this whole time that the IP address is listed right there. Once you boot into the Odroid the first time, it actually lists it right there. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the process to install ifconfig anyhow, just in case you're interested. You're going to want to, first of all, you're going to want to update and upgrade the system. So you're going to want to do since we're already in root, you don't have to do a sudo, so we're just going to do apt update. Click and type. There we go. An apt upgrade. Now that we've got that, we can go ahead and do an apt install net-tools. And once we're done with that, we should have access to a command called ifconfig. And you can see here, it's listing our IP address as 192.168.1.234. So that is the IP address that we're going to use. All right, next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to need a SSH client for your PC or Mac or whatever you're using. And I tend to use PuTTY. It's a free download, just at putty.org. And go ahead and download PuTTY. And once you run it, once you download it, you'll be presented with a window like this. And then you're just going to want to input that IP address. And go ahead and hit enter, and then go ahead and hit accept. And then you're going to want to log in with that same username that you set up during the install process. Again, Odroid and password. And now you're connected to your device over SSH. And this is where we're going to go ahead and get OMV installed at. So if you go over to the Odroid wiki for Odroid HC4 under install OMV NAS, you scroll about 2/3, 3/4 way down here. You can see connect to Odroid via SSH, which is what we did. Next, we're going to want to actually install OMV. Okay, so to do that, we're going to go ahead and copy this command, wget-o, right-click copy, and then go into your SSH, and then right-click in there. Then you can go ahead and hit enter. All right, now that's going to download a file called omvinstall.sh. Go ahead and do an ls. You can see the file exists there. Then we can change. We need to change that so that it can be executed to install that bash script. So we do a chmod plus x omvinstall.sh. And once you do that, go ahead and just hit enter. And it has modified your that file so that it can be executed. So now you just have to do a sudo /omv_install.sh. Or you could have just done a sudo bash and then that. And then you're going to want to enter your password for Odroid or whatever your username was. And it's going to go through and install OMV at this point. I'd like to mention, now that we're connecting through SSH, you can go ahead and disconnect your keyboard and your monitor if you want to, although I would wait till this whole process completes. But at this point going forward, you're either going to connect to the device through SSH or through a web browser, especially once you get OMV installed. So I'm going to go ahead and let this run through and come back when it completes. Now, if during this process, if you happen to have your device still connected to your HDMI monitor, might see LVM2 activation generator IAVM config failed. Don't worry about that. It'll still process through. It's a bug. All right, we are now done with the installation of OpenMediaVault, and that took about 16 minutes in total for the OpenMediaVault portion. So just have patience and it will get there. Now you're going to want to reboot, okay? And you can do this several different ways. You can just type in sudo reboot now and enter your password. And then you're going to lose connection because your device is rebooting. Now that that's set up, we can go ahead and actually access our device through a web browser. So go to your PC, Mac, whatever, go to a web browser, and go ahead and type in the IP address. I would give the device maybe a good 60 seconds to reboot, but then you're going to want to type in the IP address of that adapter, or sorry, of that NAS. I think mine was 234. Okay, in this case, the first boot up, for whatever reason, took about 3 minutes, so just have some patience. Subsequent boot ups really should not take that long. So go ahead and enter the IP address in your browser, and you'll get presented with a login screen now for OpenMediaVault. Default username is admin, and password is OpenMediaVault. And we're in. Now that you're in OpenMediaVault, you can go ahead and set up your device however you want to. And obviously we don't have any disks installed at this moment, but before you install the disks, I would shut down, install the disks, then boot up. But you don't have to. This actually has hot swappable bays, but I think it's just best practice typically to shut down if you can and install the drives first. Alright, so now I'm going to go ahead and shut down and install a couple of hard drives and do some benchmarking from here. Now at this point, since you've shut down, probably to install some hard drives might be a good point to, or a good time to uninstall or unplug your keyboard from the device as well as your HDMI cable. Those will not be needed anymore unless you want to leave it hooked up, but typically this is just like a network attached device. Access it through SSH or your web browser. Alright, so for these tests I'm actually going to be using these older Seagate Barracuda 2 terabyte drives. They're 7200 RPM CMR and pretty speedy drives. Obviously older technology, but that shouldn't matter. And also going to use a couple of Samsung 850 EVO 250 gigabyte SSDs just to kind of check to see if there's any performance changes between an SSD and a hard drive configuration. I'm going to test it both in single disk, RAID 0, RAID 1, BTRFS, RAID 1, and then MDadmin, obviously in the other RAID configurations. So now with the device powered down, I'm going to go ahead and slot these puppies in here. Simple as that. And then we're going to power up. And unfortunately there is no power switch on here, so to power it up you're going to have to unplug the device and then plug it back in. Or if you want to, get some sort of switchable outlet. But also probably want to, if you have the OLED, you want to make use of that. Now would be a good time to actually install the software for that. And again, HardKernel actually offers a guide on how to do that as well. To install the OLED display, the Odroid wiki at HardKernel here has under Odroid HC4 application note OLED, it shows you how to install to get time and date listed on this thing. And they do mention I2C tools, but the easier way is just to go through and install the Odroid Home Cloud display. So you can go ahead and connect to your device from your Windows machine using PuTTY. Type in your IP address for the Odroid. So now you're going to just go ahead and do the okay, so now you're going to want to do sudo apt update. We already kind of did that, but do that again. It'll require your password. All right, now you can do the sudo apt install this guy right here, Odroid home cloud display. And once we do that, now you should see it update the date and time there. Every time you boot up, that should display. Okay, so I did run several tests and several different configurations. I basically took two of the 2 terabyte 7200 RPM hard drives and ran them as single disk, RAID 1 through MDadmin and RAID 0 through MDadmin, both all formatted to ext4 file system. Then I did run BTRFS set to RAID 1 mirror, and also put BTRFS over MDadmin RAID 1. So those will probably be some pretty common use cases for this. And here you can see this is for the the Seagate ST2000DMO01 2 terabyte hard drives. And your transfer speeds, write and read here, of 1 gigabyte files over the network. Your maximum is going to be about, maximum bandwidth for a 1 gigabit Ethernet is about 125 megabytes per second. Well, it is 125 megabytes per second, but actual throughput is going to be closer to 112, 113 megabytes per second. So this is pretty much maxed out when you do a sequential write over or read over the network. Now the weird thing is, if you look over here on the BTRFS, it's actually a reduced performance on the write side of things. Not sure why, but probably just some overhead when it's calculating parity and things like that. Looking at the 1 megabyte files, which is the gray and the yellow numbers here, this is the writing of the 1 megabyte files, and yellow is writing of the reading of the 1001 megabyte files. And you can see here pretty much across the board it's all pretty much consistent. 45 to 46 megabytes per second on the writes, and about 63 to 64 megabytes per second on the reads. Now I did run this on 2 Samsung Evo SSDs to see if we could improve any of these scores much. We did on the BTRFS RAID ones, we actually improved by a little bit. Let me go back. You can see, oops. We did improve on the BTRFS write performance. If we go back one, you can see here it was 79 and 78 respectively, and here it's 95 and 96. So everything else kind of bumped up maybe a megabyte per second or two, but it didn't seem to help a whole lot in general. So SSDs, not that you'd really want to run them on here, just wanted to see if there was any way to get past that bottleneck in either here on the 1 megabyte file size or the BTRFS. Now this next thing, this may look like a mess, but this is basically showing down here, this is the CPU usage throughout the file transfer test. And you've got the different configurations here. Basically you've got the MDadmin, the blue is MDadmin RAID 1, CPU percent, and then the blue up here is basically the CPU temp. So basically all this is telling us, even though it looks kind of like a mess, is that the CPU usage in general did not really exceed 40%. It may have spiked a little bit with the MDadmin mirror RAID, but for the most part it remained below 40%. So the CPU really is not a bottleneck throughout this. And then also you can see here the CPU temperature was pretty much consistently right around 60 C. This one I think that the system had just started up, so it was pretty not warmed up completely. That's why it kind of ramped up this way, but then it did level off at about 60 C. And that gets over to the fan. Now the fan does turn on when the system or the CPU hits 60 degrees Celsius, and it kind of revs up pretty quick and then cools, then revs down once it gets down below 60 C. It does its job to keep it below 60 C. And same thing on the SSD side. You can see here that CPU usage may be a little bit higher when you're using SSD, maybe just because performance is slightly better. But for the most part, it's below 45%. And then again, the CPU temperature maintained below 60 degrees Celsius. And then just, this is basically an average of these values here, right? Just to make it easier to read. So you can see with the hard drives, you know, we're about 29 to 30% CPU usage, and then the gray is the Samsung SSD CPU usage. And then lastly, the power consumption draw from the wall. Now obviously this will vary depending on what hard drives you use, SSDs you use, or whatever, but just to give you an idea for what you might expect. And you can see here the baseline, basically with no disks installed, booting up. When it's sitting idle, only uses about 5.2 watts of power. This is power draw from the wall. And then on boot up, it peaked at about 6.4 watts. That's kind of your baseline. And then I kind of ran through with each of the SSDs, one SSD, two SSDs, one hard drive, two hard drives. Then that's the 2 terabyte ones. And I also connected 2 of the 12 terabyte hard drives, and just to see how well they'd work, and they worked perfectly fine. And but you can see here the reason why you have a 60 watt power supply is on boot up, the 2 12 terabyte drives sucked up about 53 watts of power. So, but that was only for a second or two. So, but higher wattage power supply is definitely needed if you're going to use higher capacity hard drives. But once it got down to settled down, all of them idled. You know, the 2 terabyte or the 12 terabytes. You know, they idled with a single disk at about 11 to 12 watts, and dual disk at about 16 to 17 watts. And lastly, a few points I wanted to make out. The USB 2.0 port, it actually powers a 5 terabyte USB hard drive that I plugged in. I was able to mount it and everything. And the thing is, though, because it is USB 2.0, speeds are pretty diminished. I was able to get about 35 megabytes per second local, but over the a network share doing a transfer, I was only able to get about 30 to 32 megabytes per second. That's expected. So if you're using it to share files or to back up your data, just expect to have reduced performance because of that. And as far as the fan's concerned, I kind of mentioned there about how it keeps the CPU at 60C. It doesn't get real loud. It's not a high-pitched sound at all, which is good. And it would usually just burst on and then die down, and it did a good job of keeping the CPU below 60C. And finally, the SATA ports. Now, the biggest concern I have is when you have a SATA drive installed, right, you put this in here, and there's a little bit of movement back and forth, and I'm concerned that it could, you know, if you're not careful, it could actually damage the SATA connector, because by default, I think SATA connector is only designed for about 30 insertion and removals. So if you tend to want to use like one of these for your data and the other one to occasionally back up as a hot swap or whatever, there could be some concern there. There's nothing to identify that that's actually an issue. It's just a concern of mine, especially, you know, if you have an SSD in here, right? I mean, there's a lot of movement that I could just crank on this and accidentally break the SATA port. So just be mindful of that. And I'm actually looking at making a 3D printable adapter, so you can pop this into that 3D printable adapter, and that way it'll keep it pretty much snug in this position so it doesn't do such a thing. And that about wraps it up for my review of the Odroid HardKernel HC4 device, the 2-bay toaster NAS. And obviously it has some limitations, but hopefully you can find it affordably. I'll leave a couple links in the description. I was able to find this on eBay for about $100, and then you had to buy the power adapter for about $10, so about $110 out the door with the unit with the little LCD here. Otherwise, it'll probably drop about $10 if you get it without it. You can buy it from the HardKernel website, although it is, I believe, from Europe, so you have to pay extra shipping charges, which probably equates to about what you'd get it for when buying it on eBay. So until next time, thanks for listening, and talk to you later.